In the far upper left corner of America, where the ocean reaches inland and the sky stays soft and gray for much of the year, a quiet boy came into the world. Seattle in 1942 was a city of docks and timber, of wet streets and salted air. The rain fell gently, almost daily, pattering against the wooden porches and sliding down window panes in slow, silver trails. In a small house on a hill, a child named Johnny Allen Hendrix opened his eyes to a room filled with the gray light of the Pacific Northwest. The sound of water was everywhere, dripping from eaves, running along gutters, humming a steady rhythm that would settle deep into his bones. There was no hurry in that house. The clock ticked slowly, and the world outside moved at the pace of clouds drifting across a wide, muted sky. His childhood was shaped by that soft rain and by the presence of a mother who hummed old tunes while she worked. Lucille was gentle, with tired eyes and a voice like thin smoke. She would wrap him in blankets and sing lullabies that seemed to blend with the drizzle outside. The house on East 14th Street had a small front room where the daylight filtered through lace curtains, casting lacy patterns on the wooden floor. In the corner stood a radio, its dial glowing a faint amber in the evening. The boy would sit cross-legged before it, turning the knob with careful fingers, searching through static until he found something that sounded like a heartbeat, blues, jazz, the croon of distant trumpets. Those sounds came through the rain and settled into his imagination, painting colors behind his closed eyes. In the backyard there was a patch of wet grass and a few twisted apple trees that never produced much fruit. But the space was his. He would walk out barefoot after a rain, feeling the squelch of mud between his toes, watching earthworms surface and robins tilt their heads. The air smelled of pine and wet soil, and the silence between passing cars allowed him to hear his own breathing. Sometimes he'd lie on his back and watch the clouds break apart, revealing slices of pale blue. He was a shy child, often alone, but not lonely. The world felt immense and full of hidden music in the rustle of leaves, the creak of the back porch steps, the distant whistle of a tugboat from Puget Sound. As he grew, he found a broom handle leaned against the kitchen wall. He picked it up one afternoon and held it like something precious, pretending it was an instrument. He strummed invisible strings and heard melodies that only he could perceive. His mother smiled at this, recognizing the quiet hunger for sound. When he finally touched a real guitar at a neighbor's house, he felt a shock of recognition, as if his hands already knew where to go. The instrument was heavy, made of wood and steel, and it hummed against his chest when he plucked the lowest string. The rain outside seemed to pause, listening. That single note hung in the air longer than anything he had ever experienced, and he carried its echo back home with him, cradled like a candle in the dark. The Seattle streets he walked each day were lined with modest homes, their roofs glossed by the ever-present moisture. There was a corner diner with steamed windows where men in wool coats drank black coffee in silence. The boy would press his nose to the glass, watching the shapes move slowly within the warm light. Later, he would translate those shapes into chords, the curve of a shoulder, the slant of a hat brim. Everything could become music. The streetcar tracks glistened in the lamplight, stretching toward downtown where taller buildings rose against a sky the color of charcoal. He never thought of these sights as ordinary then. They were the first verses of a song that would take decades to finish. In those early years, hardship came and went like the seasons. The family moved often, from apartment to apartment, sometimes staying with relatives. But the boy learned to find stillness anywhere. In a new room, he would sit by the window and watch the rain settle on the glass, tracing its downward journey with a fingertip. The sound of water became a constant companion, a gentle percussion that never asked anything of him. Even when voices were raised elsewhere in the house, the rain remained soft, forgiving, a curtain that could be drawn around his thoughts. He began to mimic its rhythm by tapping on his knees, a pattern that was both a comfort and a secret language. When he was old enough, he took odd jobs sweeping floors, delivering newspapers, but his mind always drifted back to the instrument he had held only briefly. He drew pictures of guitars on scraps of paper, careful to shade the curves correctly. At night, His dreams were filled with open fields and a single electric guitar leaning against a tree, glowing faintly under a moonlit sky. He didn't yet know that he would change the instrument's voice forever. He only knew a quiet longing that felt like hunger, a need to fill the silence with something beautiful. And the rain kept falling, patient and eternal, shaping the landscape of his early soul. Years later, when the world knew his name, Jimi Hendrix would still speak of Seattle with a tenderness that surprised those who only saw the blazing stage lights. He remembered the exact shade of gray the sky adopted in October, the sound of wet tires on asphalt, the smell of salt and cedar. The rain had taught him how to listen. It had taught him that silence could be as powerful as sound, and that every note should feel like water, flowing, inevitable, returning always to the earth. His first home was not a place of grandeur, but it gave him the quiet canvas upon which he could begin to paint his impossible music. And in that small house on the hill, if you listen closely, you can still hear the echo of a broom handle strummed in an empty room and the gentle applause of raindrops on the roof. When the boy's parents struggled to keep a roof overhead, he was often sent to stay with his grandmother in a neighborhood tucked between the railroad tracks and the river. Nora Hendrix was a woman built of quiet strength and Sunday church hymns. Her house was small but immaculate, with starched doilies on the armchairs and a wood stove that filled the kitchen with gentle warmth. The boy would arrive carrying a paper bag of clothes, his eyes wide and watchful. She never fussed over him. Instead, she would set a glass of milk on the table and go back to her ironing, allowing him the space to settle into the rhythm of her home. The steam rose from the iron in soft puffs, and the smell of warm cotton mingled with the scent of simmering beans. In that house, time moved differently, slower, more deliberate, unfolding like a song with only a few chords. His grandmother's garden was a wonderland of green growing things. She had planted peas and beans along a wire fence, and marigolds stood guard at the edges. He would help her pull weeds in the early morning, his small fingers grasping at stubborn roots while the dew soaked his cuffs. She taught him the names of plants by speaking them aloud like benedictions. The sun would gradually break through the coastal fog, warming their backs. In the corner of the yard, an old cherry tree leaned against the side of the shed, and each summer it offered up a handful of dark fruit. He learned patience watching that tree, the long wait from blossom to harvest, and somehow he connected that feeling to music, understanding that some beautiful things only arrive if you are willing to be still. Inside, the living room held a phonograph that spun records of gospel quartets and blues singers. The record sleeves were worn at the edges, handled with care by his grandmother when she dusted. On quiet afternoons, the boy would place the needle down gently and listen to voices that seemed to rise from the grooves like spirits. Mahalia Jackson's contralto filled the room, rich and warm as honey, while light poured through the front window and illuminated motes of dust floating lazily. He would lie on the braided rug, his head resting on his folded arms, feeling the music enter through his chest rather than his ears. It was in that room that he first understood that sound could be a physical presence, something that could wrap around you like a blanket. The house itself had a language of its own. The wooden stairs groaned underweight, the screen door wheezed when it opened, the radiator hissed in winter with a sound like crashing cymbals muffled in cotton. Each noise became familiar to the boy, part of the earliest soundtrack of his life. At night, from his small bedroom at the top of the stairs, he could hear the distant whistle of freight trains rolling past the edge of town. The whistle was a lonesome, bending note that lingered in the air long after the train had passed. He would lie awake and try to imitate that sound with his own voice, humming low in his throat until sleep finally pulled him under. In his dreams, the train became a steel guitar stretching into the darkness. Nora Hendrix also had a habit of singing while she worked. She would hum spirituals as she kneaded dough or mended clothes, her voice barely above a whisper. The boy learned to harmonize without being taught, finding notes that drifted alongside hers like two leaves falling from the same tree. She never made a show of it, never stopped her work to praise him, but sometimes she would glance over and nod once, as if to say she heard him. That small acknowledgement was more valuable than any applause. In the quiet communion of that kitchen, he discovered that music didn't need a stage. It could be as simple as two people sharing breath and melody while flower dust hung in the air. On Sundays, the grandmother dressed him in clean clothes and walked him to the neighborhood church. The building was modest, white clapboard with a steeple that pointed toward the gray sky. Inside, the pews were worn smooth by generations of worshippers. The boy sat beside his grandmother, feeling her roughened hand in his, as the choir began to sing. The sound rose and filled the wooden space, bouncing off the rafters, surrounding him with a power that made his skin prickle. He didn't understand all the words, but he understood the feeling, a joyful sorrow, a hope tangled with ache. The music in that church didn't just ask to be heard, it demanded to be felt. He would carry that lesson with him forever, the knowledge that a note could be a prayer. Her house also contained an old upright piano pushed against the parlor wall. The keys were yellowed and a few notes had lost their voice, but to the boy it was a source of endless wonder. He would press the keys one at a time, listening to how they resonated through the wood. He discovered that pressing several at once created a trembling mass of sound that seemed to open the air itself. His grandmother never stopped him from exploring the instrument, though at times she would call from the kitchen, asking him to play something pretty. He didn't know any songs yet, but he tried to make the notes sound like rain on the roof, like the train whistle, like the feeling of lying in the garden while the sun warmed his face. He was learning to translate the world into sound, one tentative finger at a time. When he eventually had to leave that house and return to the less stable world of his parents, he took with him the interior quiet that his grandmother had cultivated around him. Her home had been an island of order and calm in a sea of uncertainty. The garden, the radio, the singing, the peaceful rhythm of ironing and cooking, all of it had shaped the way he listened. Later, even amid the roar of amplifiers and screaming crowds, he could close his eyes and find the memory of that house. It was still there, the steam rising, the beans simmering, the woman humming, and the boy hearing for the first time the deep and lovely silence that lies at the heart of every great sound. After his Seattle years, the young man drifted south, drawn by the current of rhythm and blues that flowed through the veins of America. He was no longer a child, but not yet a legend, a quiet, long-fingered guitarist riding buses from one town to the next. The South unfolded before him in a slow panorama of cotton fields, pine forests, and red dirt roads that stretched toward horizons shimmering with heat. He traveled light, a single suitcase, his guitar case held like a companion. The bus windows were often smeared with dust and old rain, but through them he watched the landscape shift endlessly. The hum of the tires on asphalt became a drone note beneath the melodies forming in his mind. Each mile was a measure of rest, a pause between the demands of the stage and the stillness he craved. He found work as a sideman for traveling reviews, Little Richard, the Isley Brothers, others who needed a reliable guitarist. The shows were energetic, but this story is not about that energy. It is about what happened after the lights went down. In the small hours of the morning, he would sit alone in a motel room, the neon sign outside casting red and blue shadows through the thin curtains. The air conditioner might rattle or the ceiling fan might creak, but he didn't mind. Those sounds were familiar friends. He would open the window and let the southern night enter, the scent of jasmine, the distant barking of dogs, the zephyr that whispered through pines. Then he would sit on the edge of the bed and unzip his guitar case, cradling the instrument not to practice, but simply to hold it, feeling its quiet potential. The hotels themselves were forgettable, cinder-block walls painted beige, metal frame beds, thin towels. But to him, each room was a canvas of solitude. He would arrange his few possessions, a hairbrush, a notebook, a pack of strings. Outside, the parking lot would gleam under the moonlight, empty of cars but full of crickets. He sometimes sketched in that notebook, not words or lyrics, but the shapes of chords, the curves of a melody, little diagrams that only he could read. In the morning, the sunrise would paint the walls in shades of tangerine. He barely slept during those years, not from restlessness, but from a feeling that the quiet hours were too precious to waste on unconsciousness. The world was teaching him patience, the art of waiting for the right note. One town bled into the next: Macon, Georgia, where the magnolias dropped their white petals on wet sidewalks; Nashville, Tennessee, where the radio towers blinked red against the evening sky; Clarksville, where the river ran slow and brown under ancient bridges. He played clubs small enough that he could smell the perfume of the nearest audience member, but those moments are not the heart of this memory. The heart is the walk back to the boarding house before dawn, the gray light creeping up over the railroad tracks, the streetlights still buzzing their tired hum. He would pause sometimes on a wooden bridge and listen to the water below, a liquid rhythm that reminded him of Seattle rain. Time seemed to suspend itself in those moments. During one long stay in Nashville, he shared a rented room with other musicians. The house was a two-story Victorian that had seen better days, its paint peeling like sunburned skin. But it had a wraparound porch where he would sit in the afternoons, watching thunderstorms roll across the wide Tennessee sky. The lightning would flash silently far away, followed long seconds later by a low growl of thunder. He would tap his fingers on the wooden railing, following the rhythm of the storm. After the rain washed the dust from the leaves, the whole world smelled fresh and green. He learned then that every weather had its own key signature, its own tempo. A thunderstorm was a blues in E-flat, a drizzle was a lullaby in a minor. Meals during those traveling years were often taken at small roadside cafes where the coffee was endless and the pie was cheap. He would sit at the counter stool, his guitar case propped beside him, and watch the cook flip pancakes on the griddle. The sizzle of butter, the hiss of steam, the murmur of truckers discussing the weather, all of it blended into a warm jazz of everyday life. He rarely spoke much. He was known as the quiet one, the polite young man who always said thank you. The waitresses remembered him for his gentle smile and the way he cradled his instrument case as if it contained something alive. He would linger over his plate, stretching out the meal, letting the ordinary sounds wash over him, storing them away for some future song. In the hotter months, the southern sun could be relentless, bleaching the color from storefront awnings and making the asphalt shimmer. He would walk slowly, keeping to the shade of storefront overhangs, his long fingers occasionally brushing the brick walls as if reading their texture. Everything was a potential note: the creak of a screen door, the rattle of a loosely held window pane, the distant cry of a vendor selling peaches. He began to understand that the spaces between sounds were just as important as the sounds themselves. The silence of a sleepy southern town at 2 in the afternoon was a kind of music too, a deep breath held by the whole world. In that silence, his mind could unfurl, designing the wild, intricate tapestries of sound that would eventually change music forever. When he finally left the South for the East Coast, he carried with him not just the technical skills of a seasoned sideman, but a deeper, quieter gift. He had learned to listen to the world's hidden rhythms. The rattle of a train, the whisper of pine needles, the hum of a neon sign, the space between raindrops, all had become part of his vocabulary. The southern skies had given him a canvas of wide-open silence, and against that canvas, every sound was vivid and vital. He would soon step into the noise of New York City, but the calm he had cultivated on those long, lonesome roads would remain his anchor. He was still that boy from Seattle, listening to the rain, only now the rain was everywhere, falling quietly on every landscape he crossed.